All right, welcome back. This is going to be a very short lesson, and this is because I want you guys to still get some time to really play with and experiment with all of the contents from lesson one. But I want to go in and start getting things set up in live the way that we would want to work with this throughout a session. So you're going to want to do this every time you open up a new session to make sure all your settings are the way you want them. So the way that we open up the preferences in live, if you're on a Mac, then you're going to go to the Live tab up in the toolbar. Click on that Live tab and you will see your section. Your second option down is the Preferences option. And if you're on a PC, you're going to find the Preferences under the Options tab, probably down toward the bottom. So let's open up our Preferences panel, and you're going to get a new dialog box here. So we'll start with our first tab, the Look and the Feel. So we can go through here and we can change the way that Ableton behaves, and the way that it looks. Alright, so in our first window here, we've got the language here. We're going to keep it in English. Follow behavior. So this is for if we're working in the arrangement view and we're, say, playing a really long song and we want the song to continue scrolling rather than losing our playhead down outside of our window, then this kind of keeps it following for us. So we'll keep that on. For the most part, we can keep all of this, the default settings as it is. However, you might want to come in and customize the way that it looks, and that would be down here in the skin section. Right now it's set to default. You can change the way that Ableton Live looks. So this is completely just a custom preference. I like to use mine as default. I've just used Ableton for so long that I got kind of used to the color scheme from the default view. So otherwise, everything else can stay the same. And then when we go to the Audio tab, this is where we're going to need to pay attention, especially when we're working in the studio. So it's asking us here, our driver type. By default, these Macs have the core audio driver, so we're going to leave that. And then our audio input device. Right now, mine is set to built-in microphone. So by default, if you're just using your computer is going to be your sound card. Your computer is going to be your input device, meaning by default, the microphone on your computer is going to be the microphone that Ableton is looking for when you tell it to record audio. And the output device is also the built-in output audio from the computer. So we can leave this all the way it is for now, but when we go into the studio, this is going to be the very first thing that we change. Because we're using a third-party audio interface as our sound card for the audio coming in and the audio going out, then we would switch our audio input device in this little drop-down menu to, and obviously I don't have that device plugged into my computer, so it's not going to show up, but it would be the Thunderbolt Apollo 8, Universal Audio Apollo 8 audio device that we would select. And so we'll talk about this when we go into the studio. For now, we can leave this set to default, but just remember, when we're working in a studio environment and we have an external audio interface, we're not going to use our computer's audio chip anymore, our audio card. We're going to be using the third-party audio interface. So we'll need to change that here. We can leave it the way it is for now. Alright, so our sample rate, our in and out sample rate should be set to 48,000 kilohertz. I think by default, Ableton has it set to 44,100. We're going to set it to 48,000 samples. So think about this as like frame rate for audio. In video, we can see back naturally at about 24 frames per second. Our ears are much more sensitive than our eyes are, and we can hear the smallest difference in sound and at very many distances. So anyhow, so think of how many frames, how many pictures we're taking per second of audio samples. So we're taking a lot of pictures at 48,000 kilohertz. This is going to give us a nice high resolution sound. So we're going to change this to 48,000 kilohertz. Everything else, for the most part, you can leave at default. The buffer size, so buffer size by default, I believe, is set to 256 samples. And what this is, out of those 48,000 samples, the computer's going to take 256 of those samples, or that amount of time, to process information and send it out to your headphones. So if you're recording audio or you're putting a heavy load onto your computer, 256 samples may not be enough. Your computer might have to do a lot of processing before it outputs that audio to your headphones or to your speakers. So in that case, we would, if we hear that there's some kind of lag or that our computer is struggling, and trust me, you will know what that sounds like when it happens, then we would raise this buffer size. In raising the buffer size, though, you also raise the delay. You increase the amount of delay from the time you press your spacebar to the time that you're hearing it. So when you're recording audio and you have someone in the studio with you, they're going to have headphones on, and they're going to be performing with headphones on, and they're going to want to be in real time. They're going to be want to be as close as they can to being in real time as possible without hearing latency or delay in the headphones. So we're going to have a low buffer rate, at least 256 samples at the most when we're recording audio. And so this is so that the person in their headphones doesn't hear a delay while they're trying to perform. Otherwise, they'll get thrown off really, really bad. It's really hard to perform when you're hearing yourself a half a second later. So we want to have a low buffer size for the majority of the time, unless we get into a lot of heavy mixing and our computer's really starting to struggle, then we're going to increase that buffer size. So for now, we're going to leave it at 256 samples. This way, this isn't a lot of delay, and we'll be able to hear things in real time. So otherwise, you can leave everything else in here at default. So we're going to go to link MIDI, and this is where when we start using external control surfaces, a lot of the times Ableton will be able to pick up on what control surface you're using, and I'm talking about MIDI control. So say for instance, I have this MIDI controller and I plug it into Ableton. Ableton, the people who have created Ableton did a really good job of keeping up to date at what MIDI controllers people are using. So they have preloaded presets for specific MIDI controllers. So for instance, when I plug my MIDI controller into Ableton, automatically all of my volume knobs are now MIDI mapped to the volume knobs on that control surface. So this is where we're going to add control surfaces in this section if Ableton is unable to find the preset for that control surface. So we don't need to mess with this just yet, but when we start using MIDI control surfaces, we will. Alright, so File, Folder menu. Alright, so most of this, I believe you're going to be able to leave on the default settings. The one thing that you want to make sure is when you come down to the plugin source section at the very bottom is that you have Use Audio Units turned on, and that you have Use VST Plugin Systems folder turned on as well. And this is going to allow Ableton to go into certain folders to find plugins when we, if we use some third-party plugins, we install some, maybe a third-party equalizer or a compressor, or maybe a third-party piano, something like that. Then when we install that on our computers, the computer is Ableton is able to access those. So we just want to have those options ticked on. All right, now we have our library, and this can all just be left the way it is. This is just by default. Everything is set up for us already. File paths to packs and sounds and instruments and all of that stuff. So we're just going to leave this the way it is. The other one we want to look at is the Record, Warp, Launch menu, and this is where we're going to make some more changes. But by default, I'm not entirely sure how this was set up. But one thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that our file type here at the top is set to WAV, wave files. By default, I believe it's set to AIFF, so we want to make sure we want to change this to wave files. The bit depth that we're going to select is 24 bits. So think of this as like resolution, how clear you're seeing a picture. Is it 1920 by 1080 or 4K, that kind of thing. So this is giving us a high resolution audio. So we want to change that bit depth to 24 if it's already set to 16. Count in. For now, we're gonna have no count in. We can set that up a little bit later for having count ins to lead us into recordings. And then we want to have the clip update rate set to 1/16. And this is just going to, let's see here. So if yours is not set up to 1/16, just change it to 1/16. Basically, this is going to give us a very quick feedback response in our computers. It's going to refresh very quickly. Record session automation on armed tracks. We'll leave that toggled on. We'll get into automation probably in the second or third week. And then this is one that I want to make sure is switched off. This one can get really annoying. And this option is the start playback with record. So that means once you hit record anywhere, the computer starts recording. What I like to do, and what a lot of engineers like to do, is to not have that option, but yet to be able to arm the track, arm everything, meaning it's ready to record, and then when you're ready to record, you press the space bar, you press the play button, essentially, and then things begin to record. So this gives us a little bit of time, basically to prepare to record. So I like to have this toggled off. And what else? We're going to leave all of this warp fades set to its default settings. We're going to leave the loop warp short samples on auto, and the auto warp long samples should be turned off. This is important. So if you leave this on, then what happens is when you bring in a new piece of audio, it's going to, Ableton has this function called warp, where it's going to warp that sample to match the BPM in your session. And this is because Ableton thinks, oh, you're bringing in a new piece of audio, you must want it to match the BPM, the tempo of everything else in your song. So it will then warp that song to match that tempo, and a lot of times that can sound really awful. We might not even need to hear our BPM if we're working solely with samples. So make sure auto warp long samples is turned off. We're going to get into all of this when we start working with samples, probably here on Thursday. So we're going to have auto warp long samples turned off, and then the default warp mode is set to beats right now. That means when a sample comes in, when a new piece of audio comes into Ableton, Ableton is going to analyze it and look for the beats in the song to then conform it to fit the tempo of your session. So we'll leave it on beats for now. This can always be changed when we decide that we want to warp samples to conform to our BPM, but for now we're just going to leave auto warp long samples off, and we'll leave it on beats, and that can always be customized later. Create fades on clip edges. We're going to leave that on. It's really nice. It's a very, very short, unnoticeable fade on the end of any clip when you cut it. Say, for instance, you're recording some vocals and you decide to cut out maybe some dead space so that you're not just listening to room tone. When you cut that off, then it's going to create a very nice inaudible fade so that you don't hear pops when audio come in and out. So we want to leave create fades on clip edges automatically set to on. Default launch mode, we'll leave that set to trigger. Default launch quantization global, we'll leave that, and we'll talk about what all this is as we start to work more with Ableton. So we're going to leave all this set to its default. Select on launch is going to be left on. Select scene on launch is also going to be on. And then start recording on scene launch, we're going to have that turned off. We don't want to restart recording when we start launching scenes, so we're going to leave that set to off. And start playback with tap tempo. That's up to you. So this is when we start to, if we want to customize our tempo to maybe a rhythm we have in our head, or to another song that we want to match the tempo of, then we would find that tempo and we'd tap tempo, and this is going to start playing back the song to match that tempo. It's a little tricky sometimes, so you can turn this on or off depending on how it works for you. I'm going to turn mine off, in fact. Our next tab down is the CPU tab, and this is basically asking if our computers, sometimes computers are built with extra support for processing audio and video, and so we'll leave, if this option is there, we'll leave this on so that we have that extra CPU power. And then the next thing we have is our licensing and maintenancing here. So if you want, you can have get automatic updates turned on. I would leave it off for now because we don't have, our school doesn't have any more licenses or any update for licenses. So instead of wasting the time of having Ableton check every day if there's an update for Ableton, we already know we're not going to be getting updated, so you might as well just turn that off. So really that's where we're going to make our biggest changes here. So the biggest changes that I feel like we make here are making sure our sample rate is set to 48,000 kilohertz. We have a low buffer rate. And then if we go to the record warp launch section, we want to make sure we're recording our file type with WAV files. And our bit depth is set to 24. These are the most important elements. And then we want to go to make sure that start playback with record is not selected, that it's turned off. And otherwise, I think we're pretty set up to start recording and creating some high quality audio. Alright, so for the rest of your day, or for the rest of the day on Wednesday, I want you guys to play around with what we've got so far. So start building up your loop. Start playing with different tracks and different MIDI instruments and seeing what you can come up with. And if you want to, you can check out a MIDI controller. And then on tomorrow, I'm going to make up a video for how to start integrating and using samples. If you guys want to start using them now, I can start showing you a little bit. So you would come down to over on the left-hand side of your categories pane or panel here. You could start messing with samples and seeing how they sound. A lot of them are only one-hit samples, meaning they're just one hit. So the idea behind those is that you load them into something like the drum rack where you can continuously trigger that sample. When we start using Splice and maybe some other resources for downloading samples, a lot of them are full loops, maybe a 4-bar loop or an 8-bar loop, maybe even a 16-bar loop, that then we can just drag in and start constructing a song right in the arrangement view. A lot of times we don't even need to work in the session view. So get a feel for things, how things are working, and just start playing around essentially, and start seeing the various ways that you can play some of your audio. And yeah, it starts to be really fun. So I think that's it for today. We're just going to get Ableton set up, get our preferences set up to be a little bit more customized for our workflow, and that's it. Enjoy and have fun.